Alright, so next up we are testing the RTX 4060 in Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty. Now, I did a video earlier on the RX 6800 XT. This is on a completely different system. This is on a system with 12400F CPU. It's also only got 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3600 MHz memory. So it's not the same system, so the results can't be compared. But let's have a look at the settings quickly. We're at 1080p at the moment, and I'm just going to enable the Ultra preset here, right? Because it's a $300 GPU, you should be able to run 1080p Ultra, right? Just make sure that FSR is disabled. I literally just had a test run now, and even though FSR was set to disabled, it wasn't. Right, so one other thing to note is that crowd density is now tied to the preset settings here. If we make the preset low or set it to low, then you'll see the crowd density also goes to low. Previously, this was on under the gameplay menu. So if you want to compare results, just make sure that the crowd density setting stays the same. All right, so on the Ultra preset, just at native, and here we go. I'm just trying to reset the numbers here. This is a 60% keyboard, and it's not working so well for me. All right, we got it. So if you can see that we're getting 70 frames per second, right? But that's not right. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So just enable DLSS, disable it again, do the same with the FSR, because it definitely does not trigger properly. Okay, so there we go. Now we're at 59 frames per second, and now we aren't using any upscaling. So let's reset our numbers here and start our benchmark run. And as you can see right off the bat, we are dropping into the low 50s here. Not something that I would have expected from the 4060. I mean, I am pretty disappointed in it, and most other people are as well. I mean, it's just a rebranded 3060 with 4 gigabytes of VRAM less and frame generation enabled, right? I mean, it's not really a rebranded 3060. The 3060 has better specs. It's just the performance is pretty much on par with the 3060, except you do have frame generation on this GPU. But you can see here that I mean, we dropped into the mid 40s there for a second, and that's not what you'd expect from this price tag, right? So even though the frame rate average was pretty much almost 60 frames per second, that doesn't really tell the whole story, because we dropped below 60 frames per second more often than not. It's just the times that we were above 60 frames per second, we were well above 60, and that affected the averages. All right, so obviously this is not working. We can't do 1080p Ultra at 60 frames per second. So let's just enable the high preset, and once again native, because 1080p it's a little bit dodgy with FSR or even DLSS. The upscaling at 1080p is not the best. All right, so let's reset our numbers there and see how this one goes. So it does not look like we'll stay above 60 frames per second, which is quite strange. I did see around between 10 and 15% difference usually when switching between Ultra and high. And over here, as you can see, we're getting 70 frames per second inside. If you're wondering why I'm testing this specific area, I'm actually quite a little bit into this DLC, and so far this has been one of the more intensive areas that I could find, purely because of all the NPCs, right? It's quite taxing on the system. But now you can see that we got a very nice average there, 69 frames per second, but we still drop below 60 frames per second at times. But the nice thing about this is that we are at a high enough base frame rate to actually enable frame generation. It's a little bit of a sore topic, because I mean, at 1080p, you'd not expect to have to rely on frame generation to get a consistent 60 frames per second experience. Look at the frame rate there. I didn't do anything. It just dropped below into the mid 50s there. So it's definitely not the best GPU to experience this game with. So anyway, what we can do is let's just do one or two more tests at 1080p. We'll do the 1080p Ultra preset, right? And this time we'll not use FSR, but we'll use a DLSS on the quality preset. Let's see if we can actually maintain 60 frames per second now. And I highly doubt it, because our frame rate didn't really go up. I did see previously that it took a little while for it to actually start working. which is quite weird because usually frame generation takes a while before it kicks in. But there we go. So moved up from 54 frames per second to 68 frames per second. And so far, no drops below 60 frames per second just yet. Now, as I said, I'm not a big fan of using upscaling at 1080p. At 1440p and 4K, obviously, it's better because you are working with a higher internal resolution. If you use upscaling at 1080p, the lower internal resolution definitely becomes visible, especially on a slightly larger monitor. If you've got a 1080p 27-inch monitor, for instance, then you'll definitely start seeing some anomalies. Right, but it does seem like DLSS quality can keep us above 60 frames per second, like 99% of the time, right? I did say drop below 60 once or twice, but not the end of the world. But as I said, it's actually quite nice because personally, I think this is a high enough base frame rate for us to enable frame generation. So let's go ahead and do that. So it's just a toggle. Just going to do that and leave this on DLSS quality. All right, so 1080p on the Ultra preset, just with the frame generation enabled, DLSS set to quality, and let's reset our numbers because there was an autosave. It does seem like the autosave frequency has increased quite a bit. I'll just have to look into that because it was previously set to every 10 minutes, but now it feels like it's almost every 3 minutes, right? Anyway, doesn't really matter. You can see that we are now approaching that high refresh rate experience, right? If you've got a 120 hertz monitor, then this gets close to maxing it out. I mean, as I said earlier, it's kind of silly that you need frame generation on a $300 GPU just to be able to hit a semi-high frame rate at 1080p. I mean, sure, Cyberpunk is one of the more demanding games out there, and the latest update has affected performance slightly, but it's just I don't know, I'm very disappointed, but that's just my opinion. Alright, so now let's see what happens once we start enabling ray tracing. I've just got all the ray traced options enabled here, lighting set to medium. We have, this is actually on the high preset. I just made some manual changes, and DLSS frame generation is disabled. So DLSS super resolution set to quality, 1080p on the high preset with ray tracing set to medium. Right, let's see what happens. Don't hold your breath. Let me just try and reset the numbers, and there we go. And slightly less than I expected, dropping into the 30s there. Now, ray tracing is extremely demanding, especially in this game, especially when enabling all ray traced options, but I did expect a little bit more. Once again, really disappointed in this GPU's performance considering its cost. Now, I know that the AMD counterpart costing more or less the same, the RX 7600 performs even worse when it comes to ray tracing, but I mean, this is Nvidia's strong point, ray tracing, and this is just not a good experience even at 1080p. Right, maybe I'm just expecting a little bit too much from this card. So let's see what we actually need to do to get 60 frames per second. Even enabling frame generation at this point will result in a terrible experience actually, because our base frame rate is so low that the input latency will just be horrendous. So we'll have to use some lower quality settings here. So let's go to medium. Let's use DLSS balanced, and let's just enable all the ray traced options down here again. So now it's on the medium preset, DLSS balanced, and ray tracing set to medium. Let's see if we can get 60 frames per second here. And well, still not. I mean, we're sitting at 50 frames per second. Let's see what happens when we go down to DLSS performance here. I would not recommend you play on DLSS performance, especially at 1080p, but it does seem like we are now getting 60 frames per second. It's definitely not ideal. I mean, it'll definitely drop below 60 frames per second more often than not. As we saw earlier, if you start off at 60 frames per second, it will for sure drop below that. But fair enough, the DLSS Ultra performance, or performance where we are at now, looks better than FSR performance. I tested it earlier on the RX 6800 XT. I mean, it is definitely a lot more soft, but it doesn't look as terrible as I expected. Sure, we are at a very low internal resolution here. but the upscaling is actually doing its job pretty well, I must say. I wouldn't play like this. I'm not recommending you play like this either. It's just that it does look better than FSR. Alright, so we did get an average of 65 frames per second. So I'm just going to say that perhaps ray tracing with this GPU is not really worth it. I know I said it in some of my earlier videos when it came to the RTX 4060 as well. Let's just try DLSS balanced, right? If we can get to 50 frames per second here, then we should be okay with enabling frame generation. So let's just force balanced again, and let's see what we can do here. Just trying to reset the numbers again. All right, and now we're at 90 frames per second. So DLSS balanced, so we are at a slightly higher internal resolution than at performance. So the image quality should be better, the frame rate should be higher, and the input latency will be slightly higher than previously, because we were sitting with around 60 frames per second as a base frame rate, and now we started off with 50 frames per second. But you can see even here it's dropping into the 70s, so still not the best experience. I just think that right, maybe on these budget GPUs ray tracing is just not an option. I mean, you can enable it, go into photo mode, take a couple of nice photos, but outside of that, I don't think there's much use for ray tracing on this 4060. All right, that's just my personal opinion, of course. All right, so let's just move on to 1440p. As I said, I'll get to the path tracing tests now, but just judging by the normal RT testing, I don't think it's going to go well. So let's start off at 1440p medium. I think it's a little bit more realistic for this GPU. I'm just going to disable FSR. Just make sure that it is disabled, because we saw earlier that it does not really apply properly. So no ray tracing, and now you can see crowd density is set to low as well. Right, I'm just going to make the overlay a little bit big. I'll be right back. All right, I think we are there. Let's just reset the numbers here, and all right, so 50 frames per second. I must say that the game now looks pretty good at 1440p. The crispness, the sharpness of the images just look awesome. If you do see screen tearing in the recording, I do apologize about that. Unfortunately, the capture card, it does support VRR or variable refresh rate, but for some reason, if I do enable it, my screen flickers black every now and again. So I just disable it, and that means that you'll get some screen tearing in the recording as well. Right, this is captured externally on an external PC with an Elgato 4K Pro MK2. That's quite a mouthful. All right, so even though the game looks good, we're not getting 60 frames per second. Although I wouldn't be opposed to playing it like this. 1440p on the medium preset definitely looks a lot better, especially on this. This is a 27-inch monitor. It is a 4K monitor, so it does look a little bit more blurry when we are playing at lower than native resolutions, but this actually looks pretty good. All right, so let's just see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second. I don't think we'll need to do much. Let's just use DLSS super resolution on quality. I think that should get us to 60, right? I mean, that's quite a nice bump in performance there. We went from 55 to 75 frames per second. Let's just reset the numbers there, and off we go. But now just look at that frame time graph. It's very inconsistent. It looks like a heartbeat, right? Let me just see if it's maybe related to Nvidia Reflex low latency, and not really. It's like every few seconds. It's a little bit better now, but I don't know. So let's just go back to the previous settings here. All right, now you can see that our frame rate also dropped again for some obscure reason, but you can see that the frame time graph is very inconsistent. Now just when I had reset the numbers, the frame rate went up to 80 frames per second again. So definitely some weird things happening here with this game still. I mean, it is a new update and it did introduce new tech, etc. So I do think that there are still some issues that need to be ironed out. All right, but this is actually a pretty good experience. I mean, once again, I wouldn't mind playing like this. 1440p medium, Cyberpunk definitely still a good looking game, even with upscaling set to quality mode. I mean, once again, we aren't upscaling from a very low internal resolution, so it does help. But just look at the frame time graph again. It's very inconsistent, and it does translate to the mouse feeling particularly weird. And I did see just now that when I disable Nvidia Reflex, it does smooth out a bit, but definitely still some weird things happening. I think I'm just going to reload my save before we start testing the next setting. Alright, so the frame time graph does seem a little bit better now after I reloaded my save. So let's see if we can actually do ray tracing at 1440p. For this, I'm going to go down to the low preset here. I'm going to use a DLSS Performance, right, because why not, and just enable all the ray traced options here. Obviously you can enable these individually to cater your RT experience. I'm just enabling both to give you more I'm just enabling all of them just to give you an idea of what the total cost of all the ray traced options are. All right, so I mean, we're getting 4850 frames per second, so definitely not going to work for us. Once again, this is slightly too low to start enabling a frame generation. For me personally, I do feel the input latency, so let's go down to ultra performance, and now you can see some weird things happening. I mean, some shimmering there in the background there, but we are now getting 75 frames per second, and this is even with the ray tracing enabled, right? But just look at that arrow. I mean, that's just misbehaving completely. Once again, we are upscaling now from 720p. When you look at it up close, it really doesn't look terrible. I'm going to put a seizure warning on before this scene, don't worry about that. But wow, right, the flickering, actually it's pretty terrible. Just look at the ground there. This is not right. I mean, sure, there's a lot of twigs and stuff here, and DLSS Ultra Performance just has a lot of issues with trying to reconstruct those. Right, so still not a terrible experience gameplay wise, just a lot of visual anomalies or issues, right? So I would not recommend playing with these settings either. But we are actually maintaining 60 frames per second, and I forgot to show the counter for the lows. Just started that, shouldn't affect it too much, right? But we are able to maintain 60 frames per second, as I just said. So all in all, not terrible, even though it it definitely does not look its best. It's an ultra performance at 1440p. I'd give that a skip if I were you. So let's just do one thing. Let's just go to performance, right? It should look slightly better, the shimmering and stuff. Frame rate is a lot lower, like 25 frames per second lower. But let's see what it's like with the frame generation enabled now. Okay, so we'll just manually enable DLSS performance here again, and yeah, the input latency is pretty terrible now. There's quite a big delay, so I'm just going to refresh the numbers. I mean, sure, for a single player game you're not going to be too concerned about the input latency unless it's ridiculously high, and unfortunately at this point it is pretty high. So once again, I'd not play like this. Sure, the 4060 does support frame generation, as you can see, and it does work. It'll help you when you are CPU bound as well, but this is just not a very good experience, especially seeing that this is a shooter. I mean, it's an RPG first, but then it's a first-person shooter as well, so it'll be difficult for you to actually be extremely accurate. You'll definitely feel the input latency on the mouse. I don't know if you saw that. There's definitely still some weird graphical things happening here, so definitely not perfect. Right, so at 1440p, I do think that performance and ultra performance are best left unused. So, I mean, but I just wanted to give you an idea what the performance is like. Sorry, I'm scrolling down. So now let's move on to 4K. I mean, I'm not expecting anything good to come off of this. Let's just, I'm going to go to 4K on the low preset, just disable frame generation there. So no DLSS. no frame generation, just the low preset all by itself. And I mean, I'd be surprised if we got 30 frames per second here. Just making sure that ray tracing is disabled, and just give it a second. I don't know why it takes so long. Maybe it's just the limited VRAM at 4K that's causing it to take so long to actually stabilize. All right, but we are getting 30 frames per second here. Not too terrible. I do think we might drop below 30 frames per second at times. I haven't seen it drop yet, unless you have. I mean, I'm trying to do 17 things at once, and I mean, I do struggle to do 2 things at the same time, so I'd not be surprised if I missed it dropping below 30 frames per second here. But I mean, if you are aiming for a 4K 30 frames per second experience, then this will definitely give you one. That was just another autosave. So yeah, as I said, I think the autosave frequency is definitely increased here for some reason. But I mean, this still gives you a pretty good idea of what to expect. 4K low. There aren't very many settings that you can actually use to get a higher frame rate. So I mean, except for DLSS and frame generation, obviously. So let's start off with the DLSS here. I'm just going to jump to performance. Remember, this is without ray tracing. So let's just see if we get 60 frames per second here. And looks like we might. And performance DLSS is actually usable at 4K, right? Because you are starting off with a much higher internal resolution. I'm just looking at the ground for strange things. I mean, the shadow pop-up and stuff, I don't think that's DLSS related. It is jarring though. But on the ground itself, it does seem to be much better than previously, right? So 60 frames per second at 4K seems to be possible. You just have to use DLSS performance, and I'm not completely opposed to using performance at 4K. As I said, sure, it is quite a low internal resolution, but it's much better than performance at 1440p. And we did drop below 60 frames per second there, unfortunately. But once again, not dropping below 50 frames per second means that we can safely enable frame generation here. And when I say safely, sure, there is still a little bit of an input latency penalty, but it's just not as noticeable to someone like me anyway. You might be different and notice it, but I certainly don't really mind the additional input latency for a little bit more performance. All right, so let's I mean, I'm going to hit apply and it's going to reset. So let's do DLSS performance here and frame generation on the same settings, 4K low. Let's just wait for it to stabilize a bit. One thing that I did notice though is that on this 4060 frame generation at 4K is definitely not as much of a help as at lower resolutions. I do think it's just because of the GPU is completely overwhelmed at 4K, because over here we dropped below 60 frames per second and now we are dropping below 70 frames per second. So 10 frames per second increase with the frame generation is a bit on the low side. Usually the uplift is around 33 to 40%. And I mean, at 60 frames per second, that amounts to around 20 frames per second. So this is pretty strange behavior, but as I said, I do think that the GPU is completely overwhelmed. All right, I don't know, maybe we should try ray tracing at 4K. The menu is, I don't think frame generation works in, there we go. So frame generation takes its time to actually work properly in the menu. We were getting 22 frames per second there. So let's see if we can actually get ray tracing to work at 4K, right? So we are back on the low preset. I'm going to use everything that we can here. DLSS ultra performance, frame generation enabled. So let's just enable ray tracing on medium. So on the low preset, DLSS frame generation enabled, DLSS ultra performance enabled, and right, wish us luck. I don't think this is going to go well at all. And even if we do get 50 frames per second, actually, I mean, the input latency is not that terrible. generally, sorry, excuse you, generally when your end result is 60 frames per second, the input latency is just terrible. But over here it feels okay-ish. I wouldn't play like this, but it's not as bad as I have seen previously with this GPU at low frame rates, right? But we are still getting, I mean, it's dropping below 40 frames per second, and there you can actually feel the input latency increase quite a bit. But I mean, just look at the frame time graph. It's still very inconsistent, right? At this frame rate, at this resolution, you'd expect it to be quite flat, but oh well, so it goes. We are actually even CPU bound at times. I mean, at 4K, sure, we are running DLSS ultra performance here, but you can see that the GPU usage at that specific point drops below into the low 90s, so that's pretty strange. Anyway, I mean, this is a 12400F CPU. It's a 6-core 12-thread CPU, so I'm not expecting it to not be CPU bound in certain scenarios, but just surprised that with these settings it was. Alright, so one last test. Let's just let's go back down to 1440p or 1080p. I keep on referring to 1080p as 1440p. I know that the overlay is a little bit bigger, but I'm just going to leave it as is. Let's see what we need to do to get path tracing working here. Right, so I'm on the low preset, and we'll be using DLSS balanced at 1080p, and we'll be using path tracing. Right, so the moment you enable path tracing, yeah, you'll see that all the other ray traced settings do disappear. 1080p, balanced super resolution, and no frame generation. But I do think we'll need to enable it to get some playable frame rates here, right? So getting 30 frames per second. And once again at 1080p with aggressive upscaling enabled, the game just, it looks terrible. This is not something that you should actually be using. Path tracing on a 4060, I'm sorry, it's not it's not made for it. Even though it supports it, don't use it. This is just a terrible experience. I mean, even if you are aiming for 30 frames per second, right, we can lock it to 30 frames per second and the frame time graph will be a lot smoother. The visuals still look pretty bad. I mean, that's the whole point of ray tracing, right? You want better visuals, but at this at these settings, the sacrifice you have to make to visual fidelity just to enable ray tracing is just not worth it to me. That's just my opinion, but that's also my recommendation. Don't use path tracing with the 4060. Let's just see if we go down to ultra performance, if we can actually hit 60 frames per second here. Right, so we are at least getting 60 frames per second, but at what cost? This is, I mean, just look at the, in the distance there, everything just melts together. Like there's no distinction whatsoever between any of the NPCs in the background that are moving. The ones that are standing still, sure, they are okay. But, I mean, just look at, there's a guy supposed to be sitting on the crate there, right? And there he is. Okay. That's quite funny. Yeah, this is not something that I'd recommend you use. But just for giggles, I'm going to enable frame generation here, and just to see what kind of frame rate we can actually get, right? I mean, getting 110 frames per second with path tracing, but as I said, I don't think like the visual quality loss is just not worth it. And the input latency, even though we are getting 110 frames per second here, it's not ideal. Like it actually felt better on some of the previous settings where the final output was like 60-70 frames per second. So, I mean, once again, I don't think path tracing was meant for a 4060, and even though it does have frame generation, it does support ray reconstruction and all that kind of stuff. Like it's just not the GPU that you'll be comfortable enabling it on, right? Or I won't be. I mean, just look at the crates in the distance there. Like that just looks terrible. Now, one thing that ray reconstruction is the latest addition and ray reconstruction was actually enabled during this run. So what it does in Cyberpunk in particular is it improves the performance with path tracing a little bit, but that's not what it was entirely meant to do. It's just to make reflections and that kind of stuff a lot more accurate. There is still some issues with it. I'd recommend you watch the Digital Foundry video on DLSS ray reconstruction. They actually have very good in-depth videos. The only issue with the ray reconstruction at the moment is that you do need path tracing enabled, right? So with normal ray tracing, you cannot enable DLSS ray reconstruction, which is, I mean, kind of pointless at this point, because it does support all RTX GPUs, but if only the RTX 4070 and above can do path tracing, like what's the point of having it enabled? Now, I did say that an Nvidia employee did reply to one of my tweets. They said that they are working on getting this working without path tracing being enabled and just normal ray tracing being enabled, right? But as you can see, there we are. This is what it looks like at 1080p with playable path traced settings, and it's definitely not a good experience. Alright, and that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.